Sorry. Hi, I was muted. Welcome to the Preservation Resource Center's live class for today. I'm Serena Mohan. I'm the Director of Public Programming and Events at the Preservation Resource Center, and we are so happy to have everyone here. I wanted to quickly thank our supporters and sponsors. Thank you to Stephen Richard Parnes for supporting our live online classes that we've been doing through this whole time where we're all safe at home. And he has really made this possible by supporting our programs. If anyone is interested in sponsoring our online programming, which will continue for a while into the future, we would welcome that support. Please reach out to us. You can reach out to me, smohan@prcno.org, or reach out to our Director of Development, Katie Fayard. We are happy to provide you some more information about how you can sponsor any of our online programming. Thank you to our members who are here today and watching on Facebook. Our members really do make the work that the PRC does possible. We are so grateful to everyone who is a member of our organization, and the membership that you have with the PRC supports not only this live online programming, but the production of our Preservation in Print magazine, which members receive to their doorstep 9 times a year. That award-winning magazine covers such a wide variety of incredible historic preservation-related topics. And so if you would like to become a member to get that magazine, please, please, please do. We would love that. Members also get other interesting perks, like the members-only virtual tour of the World Trade Center that we're doing tomorrow night. We are so excited to see a sneak peek of that renovation, and that event is open to members only. If you're not a member yet and you are interested in seeing the World Trade Center renovation, learning about the history of the building and how that renovation came to be, we have an incredible team of including the architects, contractors, tax credit advisors, et cetera, who are going to tell us about the building and also walk us through the building and show us some of what's going on there today that we can't see because we don't have access to the building live in person. So I think that'll be really exciting. If you're not a member yet and you'd like to see that and come to that online virtual tour, please join the PRC and you can receive some information about that. Members will receive the password to get into the Zoom for that. So thank you to our members. If you are watching on Zoom, if you're in the Zoom room with us, you're correct that your camera is off and your mic is off, but we still are happy to take a few questions for you when we're finished. You can ask your questions in the Q&A button on the bottom. If you have any other issues, feel free to write them in the chat box, and I'll be monitoring that throughout the presentation. If you're watching on Facebook, thank you for joining us. We're really glad you're here. We hope you learn a lot. Unfortunately, we won't necessarily see any questions that you have, but as always, please feel free to reach out to me with any questions, concerns, ideas for other topics you might want to see us cover in the future. Again, my email is smohan@prcno.org. You can also find more information about what upcoming events at our website, prcno.org. We have incredible merchandise for sale there as well. We have a wonderful coffee table book for sale. We also have fun t-shirts, so please check that out. There are so many ways that we would love to have you support us at the PRC. And if you have any questions, please reach out to us. So I don't want to hold this up anymore. We have a wonderful talk today with Katrina Horning, who is the founder of New Orleans Architecture Tours. She has lived in New Orleans since 2004. She graduated from Tulane University and studied a wide variety of history topics. She loves New Orleans, and she has been running this incredible tour company and knows so much about architecture. The tours specialize in architecture, some of them. So Katrina is going to tell us today more about some of the most famed architects in the city and the buildings that they are most known for. So without further ado, Katrina, I'm going to turn this over to you.
Thanks, Serena. First of all, I'd like to thank the Preservation Resource Center for inviting me to present this topic. And of course, I would like to thank all of you for joining me today. I have been lucky enough to be a tour guide in this great city for the past 7 years, and much of my time is spent doing deep dives into the history of different buildings. One of the things that I find most interesting is the people behind the buildings. These architects overcame many obstacles such as silty, unstable soil, shallow water tables, and lack of good building materials to create one of the most unique urban landscapes in the world. While there are many people that we can discuss today, I wanted to share a few of my favorites. James Gallier, who is probably our most famous architect, who built up the Central Business District. James Dakin, who is best known for designing the old Louisiana State Capitol building. William Farrett, who designed many buildings in the CBD and Garden District. And Thomas Sully, who designed our first 10-story high-rise. So let's start with James Gallier. James Gallagher Sr. was born in 1798 in Ireland. It is unclear when James Gallagher officially changed his name to Gallier, but the first 2 paragraphs of his autobiography discuss his belief that his family name had been Gallier when they were in France, but anglicized to Gallagher in Ireland. His father, Thaddeus Gallagher, was a builder, and much of James's learning was done on the job helping his father. He was accepted into the Dublin School of Fine Arts, where he studied architectural drawing and worked on building projects on his days off. At the age of 24, a move to England brought James more opportunities to learn his new trade and a chance to start a family. He worked on varying architectural projects, including college buildings, prisons, and factories. A year after his arrival, he married a woman named Elizabeth Tyler. Together, they had 4 children, of which only one, James Gallier Jr., survived into adulthood.
Sorry to interrupt you. Katrina, some people are saying that they're having trouble hearing you. Is it possible for you to get closer to your mic or turn your volume up on your end?
Sure, I could try. Let me see.
That sounded louder.
Is that better?
I think so.
Yeah, guys, is it better?
Yep, I'm getting some answers that they can hear you better.
And good. I'm so sorry, guys.
I had a couple of questions about your camera. Katrina's camera is off by design, so you're not missing anything on that end. All right, I think we're ready to go. Thank you.
All right, wonderful. Thanks, guys, for the notice. In 1832, James Gallier moved to New York, where he was hired into the firm of Town, Davis, and Dakin. We will be talking more about James Dakin soon, so just keep in mind that James Dakin hired James Gallier in New York City. James Gallier learned the ropes of New York architecture in this firm for a few months, and then opened a firm with Minard Lefevre, a man who was an excellent architect, but was better known for his instructional manuals. These books, especially The Modern Builder's Guide and The Beauties of Modern Architecture, helped spread Greek Revival-styled architecture in the United States. Following his partner's lead, Gallier published his own book, American Builder's Price Book. This book wasn't really profitable, but it got his name out there. James Gallier's business was growing, but he was not finding the work enjoyable. He was expected to create the drawings of the buildings, but not otherwise be involved in the construction itself. He decided to seek his fortune in New Orleans and left New York in 1834, taking James Dakin's younger brother, Charles Dakin, with him. Once in New Orleans, the architecture firm of Gallier and Dakin was started, and they got to work quickly. Their first project was known as the Three Sisters, a collection of 3 double-gallery townhouses on Rampart Street, between Iberville and Bienville Streets. These homes were Greek Revival in style and included Greek key doors and Tower of the Winds Corinthian columns, capped by a triangular pediment. The heavy appearance is a hallmark of this style. As North Rampart Street shifted from residential to commercial, the Vieux Carré Commission's control of the street was repealed, resulting in a lack of regulation for old structures. Sadly, these homes fell into disrepair and were demolished by 1950. This spot is now where one would find the parking lot for the New Orleans Athletic Club. As they were working on the Three Sisters, Gallier and Charles Dakin were hired to draw up plans for the St. Charles Hotel. The firm was paid $10,000 for the drawings and superintendence of construction. This was James Gallier's first introduction to building large structures on the city's alluvial geology, and he adjusted accordingly. Unlike New York, under which sturdy bedrock supports everything built on it, New Orleans land does not have anything to support it, as it is composed of silty soil deposited by the Mississippi River. Think of it like building on soup. Buildings are definitely going to sink, but the issue is determining how much. In his autobiography, he states that he allowed for the building to sink about 18 inches, but it sunk a foot extra. The building was enormous, taking up a city block, bounded by St. Charles Avenue, Carondelet, Gravier, and common streets. The floor was raised 14 feet on imported granite piers with a portico surrounded by Corinthian columns. The portico, or covered porch, allowed for guests to stroll leisurely outside in the shade above the dirty sidewalks. The front facade on St. Charles Avenue was capped by a triangular pediment in keeping with the Greek Revival style. Inside, there were 350 rooms, private suites, a dining room that was large enough to accommodate 500 diners, a 14-room bathing area with hot and cold water, gender-segregated seating and dining areas, and a large kitchen to the rear. This four-story building seemed to have everything a traveler would need. At a height of 203 feet, this was the tallest building in New Orleans at the time, and the domed cupola could be seen for miles. This magnificent structure was destroyed in a fire in 1851, and although it was rebuilt, the design was streamlined and did not include the soaring dome. The Gallier and Dakin partnership would only last a year, as Charles Dakin's brother James moved to New Orleans shortly after, dissolving the Gallier and Dakin firm and creating the Dakin and Dakin firm. In his autobiography, James Gallier claims that he offered to withdraw from the firm of Gallier and Dakin as he, quote, doubted whether the three of us could agree together in such a business as ours, end quote. While the city of New Orleans was growing rapidly, it was still a small town in that the careers of the Dakins and Gallier would be intertwined even after their separation. St. Patrick's Church at 724 Camp Street rises out of the central business district to a soaring height of 185 feet. It was designed in the Gothic Revival style by the Dakin brothers firm, but due to issues of a structural nature, this building had to be completed by James Gallier. In his autobiography, James Gallier stated, quote, a plan having been made by Dakin for a new Catholic church on Camp Street, he was employed by the committee to superintend its erection, but when the walls of the building reached nearly to the roof, a disagreement between Dakin and the managers took place, and he withdrew from the undertaking, end quote. As Gallier's autobiography was widely read, this had been the official story, but there are some doubts to the simplicity of this story. In his book, James Dakin Architect, Arthur Scully presents a different picture of the history of the construction of the church that sheds a different light on the situation. It would appear that instead of walking off the project after a disagreement with the management, James Dakin was kicked off the project in favor of getting a new architect on it, James Gallier. In the third stage of construction, as the walls were being completed, the brick contractor told the committee that bond timbers, which are wooden pieces added to the walls to fortify the structure, had not been used. A committee was formed consisting of James Gallier and a few of his colleagues in the architectural profession. The committee fired James Dakin and awarded the contract to James Gallier. Curiously, once on the job, James Gallier did not add bond timbers to the walls, perhaps as they were not needed after all. A series of court cases followed, and the Supreme Court found in favor of James Dakin, but by that time, James Gallier had completed construction of the church, and Dakin's reputation was tarnished. Was it really a situation where authorities had to step in that the building was not structurally sound? Or was there some sort of bad blood between Gallier and Dakin that stretched back to James Dakin's arrival in town just a few years earlier? It's hard to figure this out, but one gets the idea that we do not have all the facts in this case. It should be noted that the current church was heavily modified from James Dakin's original plans. His drawings are on the left of this slide. The middle picture is York Minster Cathedral, the church that he was inspired by. And then the picture on the right is the current St. Patrick's Church that was modified by James Gallier. Instead of double windows decorated with tracery, each face of the tower has a plain single arched window. Decorative pinnacles were scrapped from the plan as well. In 1836, the city of New Orleans, which now expanded outside its original French Quarter borders to include the Central Business District, Lower Garden District, Tremé, Marigny, and Bywater, decided to split into 3 separate municipalities. The division is as follows. The first municipality contained the French Quarter and the Tremé, where the population was mostly French, Spanish, and French-speaking free people of color. The second municipality stretched from Canal Street to Felicity Street, where the population was mostly Anglophone American, and the third municipality was the Marigny and the Bywater areas, whose population was made up of more Creoles, free people of color, and various immigrant groups. The division into separate municipalities necessitated the building of new government offices. In 1837, James Dakin was tapped to design the second municipality hall, but following a depression that affected government funds, the Dakin plan was scrapped. When plans were resumed in 1845, James Gallier was now at the helm of the planning process, and one has to wonder if this is related to the St. Patrick's Church debacle. While it was smaller than the St. Charles Hotel, as it was designed in the Greek Revival style, it has very similar elements. There's a triangular pediment supported by columns, in this case are of the Ionic order. There is no dome on this building, but instead of a plain triangular pediment, we now have sculptures of women representing justice, liberty, and commerce. Owing to the proliferation of trade in the northeastern United States at the time, most of the building materials used for the facade came from the Northeast, such as Tuckahoe marble from Westchester County, New York, and Milford granite, which was imported from Milford, Massachusetts. The building is constructed out of brick, which is covered in plaster and scored to look like more costly marble. When the city was reunited in 1853, this building became the New Orleans City Hall. It would be the seat of our local government from May 1853 until city government moved to the current City Hall located on Perdido Street in 1957. Today, this building is referred to as Gallier Hall and is used as an event space. While James Gallier is known for his large public projects, he also worked on a few smaller residences in the city of Lafayette. The city of Lafayette was located upriver from New Orleans and was being settled by wealthy Americans. It was annexed into New Orleans in 1853 and is now known as the neighborhoods of the Garden District and the Irish Channel. In 1859, a wealthy gambler named Cuthbert Bullitt contracted James Gallier to build this Gothic Revival-style home from him. The main characteristics of this style include pointed arch windows, a quatrefoil carving, and vertical massing. While this home is beautiful, what draws the observer's eye to it is its uniqueness. At a time when, at a time when most of the inhabitants of Lafayette were American Protestants, Gothic Revival was the style of Catholic churches, so Greek Revival and later Italianate styles were preferred. Bullitt sold this home before it was completed, perhaps as a result of the aforementioned gambling. It was sold to Charles Briggs, an Englishman who is best known for his abolitionist leanings. Next door, a servant's quarter follows the same remarkable Gothic Revival style, but with wider ogee arches. That's the little black and white picture. The ogee arches are the arches over the windows. They're not quite the pointed arches of the regular house. A year following this project, James Gallier retired. The Garden District neighborhood has incredible antebellum mansions, and one has to wonder what his contribution to the area would have been if only he hadn't retired just as major construction was just beginning. James Gallier retired in 1850, leaving his business to his son, fellow architect James Gallier Jr. Upon retiring, James Sr. spent a good deal of time traveling with his second wife, Catherine Robinson. Many of Gallier's impressions of traveling abroad are recounted in his autobiography, published in 1864. On their way home from New York in October 1866, their ship, the Evening Star, sank in a hurricane off the coast of Georgia, killing most of the passengers, including the Galliers. James Jr. designed this memorial marker for them in St. Louis No. 3. Almost a decade after his death, Gallier's name was still in the headlines as his heirs were in court fighting over his property. As he had married Catherine Robinson later in life, she already had children of her own from a previous marriage. James Gallier's will said that his property would go to her in the event of his death, but she died too, so his own children would now be his next of kin. But the Robinson children were not satisfied with this decision, and so it was brought to court. This is where it gets tricky. The court had to try to figure out who died first in the shipwreck. If James Gallier died before his wife, then the property would go to her and therefore her successors. But if Catherine died first, then the property would stay with James Gallier Sr. and go to his descendants. As the plaintiffs in the case, the Robinsons had to prove that their mother had lived longer than their stepfather. One of the main points considered was the health and age of the deceased. James Gallier was not only 24 years older than his wife at the time, but he also had been in poor health. It's safe to presume that James had died first. but this wasn't actual proof that he had died first. Before they made their decision, the judge told the jury, quote, "Your duty is simply to determine the question of survivorship. If Mrs. Gallier is shown to your satisfaction to have survived her husband, you will return a verdict for the plaintiffs. If you are not so convinced, you will return a verdict for the defendants." They decided for James Gallier Jr.'s family, the defendants. Now that we have talked at great length about our most famous architect, let's move on to James Dakin. No known portraits remain of James Dakin, so I included some of his architectural renderings here. James Dakin was born in 1806 in the township of Northeast New York. Unlike James Gallier, who arrived to the United States to seek his fortune, James Dakin was not only born in the United States, but could trace his family history back to colonial Massachusetts, at least as far back as the 1650s. When James was 13 years old, his father passed away, leaving his mother all alone with 6 children. She decided to send James to his aunt's house in Hudson, New York. His uncle, Herman Stoddard, was a carpenter and taught James his trade. In 1829, James moved to New York City to pursue architecture. As luck would have it, he managed to secure an apprenticeship with the firm of Town and Davis, 2 of the most renowned architects in New York in this era. According to Arthur Scully in his book, James Dakin Architect, James Dakin was an incredible draftsman, certainly comparable to Andrew Jackson Davis, who is considered by some to be the best artist of all American architects of the past. As such, it is difficult to tell which buildings were designed by which member of the firm. Here are some of the projects that he worked on in New York. Town, Davis, and Dakin's plans were very popular, not only in New York, but also in other areas. In New Orleans, the firm was hired by A.T. Wood to design a set of 13 row houses on Julia Street. These buildings, now referred to as Julia Row, are sometimes attributed in design to A.T. Wood, as he was also an architect, but according to Town, Davis, and Dakin records, Dakin was paid $140. These buildings are a combination of the older Federal style and the emerging Greek Revival style. The Federal style features include the exposed brick, green shutters, and doors that include semicircular fan lights decorated with plaster floral bouquets. On the Greek Revival side, up in the attic level, one finds a Doric entablature, which is undecorated but pierced with plain, boxy attic windows. These buildings are very reminiscent of contemporary Northeastern architecture, most notably in Baltimore and Philadelphia. While these buildings were very popular upon their completion in 1832, decades later, as people moved out of the urban core, quite a few of them were neglected and turned into boarding houses and commercial properties. In 1972, Sam Wilson wrote, quote, "It is not difficult to imagine the fine effect this row must have once presented before later owners, seeking to express their own individuality, destroyed the essential unity of the row by changing cornices, doors, and windows, and, more recently, adding a rash of signs and unsightly fire escapes. Restored to its original form, this row would be an architectural treasure comparable to the Pontalba buildings, for which they might be considered a prototype." End quote. Indeed, built almost 20 years before the Pontalba buildings in the French Quarter, these buildings blend the Creole townhouses that include commercial properties on the lowest floors, while allowing apartments above, with newly arriving American decorative styling. It would be surprising if they did not influence the designs of Michaela Pontalba's celebrated buildings. Luckily, by the time of this writing, the 13 Sisters of Julia Row have seen a renewed appreciation for their timeless beauty due to the work of the Preservation Resource Center, who purchased one of the buildings in 1976 and renovated it, inspiring other people to do the same. James Dakin moved from New York to New Orleans in 1835 to join his brother Charles, who had started a firm with James Gallier in New Orleans a year earlier. His arrival, of course, dissolved the firm of Gallier and Dakin, and the firm of Dakin and Dakin was born. Charles Dakin set up an office in Mobile, Alabama, and James opened up the New Orleans office. James soon found himself designing a hotel, the Veranda, located across the street from the St. Charles Hotel that his brother and James Gallier Sr. had designed a couple of years before. While smaller and simpler than the St. Charles Hotel, this hotel was impressive in its use of iron for its namesake, the Veranda. According to James Dakin biographer Sully, this was the first building in town to use galleries instead of balconies. It is normally claimed that the Pontalba buildings were the inspiration for cast iron that one sees all over New Orleans, but it would appear that these galleries were started a decade earlier in the central business district. Sadly, the veranda was destroyed in a fire in 1855 and not rebuilt. In 1839, the state government located in New Orleans decided that they needed a new arsenal to store weapons and ammunition. The site for this new armory was at 600 St. Peter Street, behind the Cabildo. Many architects submitted plans, and James Dakin's were chosen, perhaps due to his role in the state militia, which we will talk about on the next slide. Although it is designed in the Greek Revival style, it isn't exactly the typical Greek Revival temple that we all think about when we hear the words Greek Revival. What we have is a very square building that seems to be missing the triangular pediment, one of the hallmarks of this style. Instead of the large triangle, we have a boxy parapet that includes a relief of a pelican and exploding bombs. Instead of a recessed portico with a porch, there are two-story recessed windows covered with iron screens and an iron door. With all the metal and reliefs of ammunition, it is not surprising to hear that this is an armory. This building is very unique for New Orleans, but it has a cousin in Philadelphia. Designed in 1824 by John Haviland, the Philadelphia History Museum is very similar in that it contains 4 two-story tall boxy pilasters, and while also lacking a triangular pediment, the building is capped by a parapet. Overall, the Philadelphia structure is much more simple than the Louisiana arsenal, as it has no decorative reliefs. Perhaps as Dakin had spent his early life in New York City, one would imagine he had traveled to Philadelphia and seen this building. That's the picture in the middle. I also added the Bank of Louisville to this slide. It was designed by James Dakin a couple years earlier before Louisiana State Armory, and it has a very similar look. In 1846, the Mexican War broke out between the United States and Mexico over a land dispute in Texas. General Taylor of the United States called upon the militias of Louisiana and Texas to secure the area around Point Isabel. James Dakin had joined the Washington Guards as early as 1837, just a few years after arriving in New Orleans. He was promoted all the way up to colonel in that company. He led his men to Point Isabel and awaited orders. After running drills for weeks, Dakin's militia unit was recalled home by an act of Congress, which disbanded all 6-month volunteer units in favor of full-year commitments. Dakin brought his men home and quit the military altogether. In 1845, a provision in the new Louisiana state constitution demanded that the state government be moved out of New Orleans. Baton Rouge, a small town above New Orleans on the Mississippi River, was chosen to be state capital. A capital design contest was issued, and many architects submitted their plans. Dakin's plan was very different from the rest, in that it was a Gothic Revival castle. In his diary, Dakin explained his style choice for 2 main reasons. It was cheaper than other styles, and it was very unique. By this time, Greek Revival had already been done everywhere, and James Dakin was over it. The cornerstone was laid November 1st, 1848, with much celebrating. Masonic Lodge members came from New Orleans to conduct the ceremony. Speeches were spoken, songs were sung, dinner was eaten. It was a most magnificent day. 3 cheers for Dakin and his glorious new capital. But then it was time to get to work. Of course, there were issues. The materials were late. Cast iron came from as far away as Pittsburgh, and roofing slate was imported from Liverpool. In some cases, the materials arrived only to be found that they had not been the best quality. Iron pieces were brittle, and bricks showed up broken. After dealing with all of these frustrations, James Dakin's temper finally erupted on August 3, 1848, when he punched William Pratt for bringing a load of bad bricks to the project. The police were called, and Dakin was fined $13. Despite these challenges, construction carried on. The building was dedicated December 1st, 1849, and fully completed 1852. It is a brick building covered in marble. It has 4 crenellated towers. Pointed arch windows are abundant on all the towers, and the front door and windows are shaped into ogee arches. Decorative features include iron tracery on the larger windows and crenellation on the roof. It is a castle after all. It is one of two antebellum Gothic revival capitals that are left in the United States. The other one is in Georgia. Not everyone were fans of the building. In his book, Life on the Mississippi, Mark Twain describes it as, quote, pathetic enough that a whitewashed castle with turrets and things should ever have been built in this otherwise honorable place, end quote. In 1862, the Confederate Louisiana state government moved out of Baton Rouge when the Union took over. A month later, a large fire engulfed the building, destroying the interior. Renovations were overseen by William Farrett, who, as we will see, added some of his own flourishes to the building. With the construction of a new Louisiana state capitol in 1932, Dakin's masterpiece was no longer used to host government actions. Today, it is a museum. Even though he was up in Baton Rouge working on the state capitol, James Dakin's attentions were still on New Orleans architectural activities. As early as 1846, Dakin had been interested in designing the new Custom House on Canal Street. He submitted 3 different plans, but was passed over in favor of A.T. Wood. When A.T. Wood was dismissed from the project over a contract issue, Dakin seized his chance to work on this federal project. He wrote letters to friends in government and even visited Washington, D.C. to plead his case. He was appointed as second architect to the Custom House in 1850. While he was required to follow Wood's design, he had serious misgivings with the plans as they were written. He strongly recommended a switch to cast iron instead of heavy masonry, which would have saved money and also cut down on construction time. According to Scully, quote, this suggestion for the use of iron was amazing for its time. Had Dakin's recommendations been carried out, this would have been the earliest known instance of cast iron being used in a substantial portion of a major American building. His proposing this new material for the largest building in the United States again demonstrates that Dakin reserves to rank among America's finest and most imaginative architects, end quote. Take that, James Gallier, you job-stealing such and such. Dakin pushed back and a controversy developed over plans of the building. The federal government even discussed replacing Dakin with James Gallier. After about a year on the project, James Dakin resigned. Over the next 40 years, 4 more architects worked on the Custom House. In the end, many of Dakin's recommendations were actually used, including the iron supports. After the nightmare of trying to start work on the Custom House, James Dakin returned to Baton Rouge to tinker around with the completion of the Capitol. Almost finished, the last step was to create a fence to secure the building. He designed a cast iron fence that resembles the tracery in his pointed arch windows of the corresponding building. The gate posts support large bald eagles with its wings outstretched, and major decorative pieces include fleur-de-lis and magnolia seed pods. James Dakin died on May 13, 1852. His cause of death is unknown, as is the actual place of burial. His death was reported in the Baton Rouge Comet, suggesting that he was buried up there. But Arthur Scully also believes there's a possibility that he was reburied in the Girard Street Cemetery in New Orleans. The story of James Dakin breaks my heart. You really get the impression that he was ahead of his time and would have done better if he was just 5 years or 10 years later, once architecture started getting more experimental. Now that we have talked about our 2 antebellum architects, it's time to move on to William Freret, who started before the Civil War and was working on projects after it as well. William Freret was born in 1833. In this presentation, William Freret is the only native New Orleanian, so for all of you keeping track, he went to high school here. On his father's side, William could trace his New Orleanian roots a few generations. His grandfather, Jean-Baptiste Farrett, is found in city directories as early as 1800, before the Louisiana Purchase. Once here, Jean-Baptiste Farrett married a Creole woman named Mary Eugenie Rouillot. The Rouillot family is an old New Orleans family that includes Edgar Degas and Norbert Rouillot. William Farrett was educated in England, where he received a degree in engineering. He returned to New Orleans and got right to work. In 1858, William Farrett designed the 3-story Merchants Mutual Insurance Building on Canal Street between Charles and St. Camp. Technology is changing, and he makes great use of cast iron to create the front facade of the building. The ground floor originally had fluted Corinthian columns. Above, in the second story, there are columns that are shaped like thick spirals, and decorating the third story, we have another set of Corinthian capped columns, which are unique in that they are carved with horizontal decorations. By this period, we are done with Greek Revival style, and Italianate is taking over. Instead of square windows, they are now arched. Bullseye windows pierce the top story and are decorated with cast iron railings. At the top of the building, the parapet contains symbols of the insurance company, such as an anchor, cotton bales, a fire hose, boat sails, and the roof of a house. Incredibly, these details are still up there. Construction began in 1859, and soon it was the talk of the town, especially the spiraling columns on the second floor. There was even an article in the paper cautioning readers to hold off forming an opinion until the buildings were finished, and reminding them that there was no reason to continue doing things the old way. We are innovative Americans after all. One has to be glad that William Farrett did not hear the public grumbling and modify his plans to something safer or more ordinary. Or perhaps his resolve was cemented by support from the newspaper article. In any event, it's these undulating, spiraling columns that make this building so unique. The next year, William Freret was working on the Maresk Building. While building started immediately, construction ceased completely during the Civil War, leaving it only half completed. A few years later, a local newspaper reported, quote, "This magnificent specimen of architecture, which for several years has been standing in an unfinished state, glimmering at times in the pale moonlight like an Alhambra ruin, rather than seeming to be like a latter-day building erected for commercial purposes," end quote. While the Mutual Insurance Company building had a cast iron facade, this building was constructed with much more cast iron. Cast iron was gaining popularity throughout the United States for a few reasons. It could be molded into fanciful designs, and it was thought to be inflammable. So let's talk fanciful designs. The windows and doors on the bottom floor had horseshoe arches resting on columns. The tall second and third story windows were surrounded by ogee arches. Ogee arches, of course, being pointy like Gothic arches, but the sides sort of make an S shape. Its style was unique and so admired that instead of naming the building after the company that owned it, like the Hibernia Bank Building or the St. Charles Hotel, this building is named for its unique style, the Maresk Building. On the afternoon of April 15, 1897, a fire broke out on the third floor. In a few hours, the building was rubble. One cannot help but feel remorse for being born too late to see this remarkable building. Today, this space is the home of the Whitney Hotel, a Beaux-Arts-style bank building that was designed by Diebel, Owen, and Goldstein. In 1861, William joined the Orleans Light Horse, a light cavalry unit which was present at the Battle of Shiloh. In this setting, the light horse were utilized as escorts and messengers for Major General Leonidas Polk. Just a month later, Farrett left the Orleans Light Horse to join the 5th Company Washington Artillery. His talents for construction and engineering were quickly recognized, and he was added to the engineering corps under Major General Kirby Smith, who promoted William to lieutenant and later lieutenant colonel. In 1865, William was discharged due to illness. He returned home to New Orleans. William Farrett was very active in the Garden District both before and after the Civil War. Here are a couple of the residences he designed. On the left, we have a delightful Swiss chalet house. Swiss chalets are known for their steep peaked roofs, which helps with snow removal. Luckily, New Orleans doesn't get a lot of snow, so this style didn't really catch on here, but you will find them in other places. This house was built for the Eustace family, who wanted a house like they saw in an architecture pattern book called Holly's Country Seats. On the right, we have a picture of one of 5 speculative houses that were designed in the Greek Revival / Italianate transitional style that was popular from the 1850s to 1860s or so. On the Greek Revival side, there are Corinthian columns, square windows, and dentils, those little squares along the roofline. On the Italianate side, there are those double brackets above every column, an arched opening over the door, and cast iron galleries. As we already discussed in the last section, James Dakin designed the Louisiana state capitol, but it was badly burned by fire during the Civil War. In 1881, William Freret was assigned to restore the building. According to a 1994 article in Preservation of Print, he had, quote, fully intended to restore the building to its original form under Dakin's plan, but extensive fire damage, years of neglect, lack of documentation, and an expanded legislature forced him to make major changes, end quote. He had to add a fourth floor to accommodate the larger legislative offices, but he also added some interesting decorative features as well. On the exterior, Ferret's most notable change was the addition of cast iron turrets, which unfortunately only lasted until the 1930s. Inside, one can still find Ferret's most celebrated modification, the stained glass dome. In the original design, James Dakin had placed a clear glass oval skylight to allow light into the space. Now, 40 years later, Farrett utilized the lightweight cast iron to suspend colored glass panes to create a kaleidoscope of color. The old Louisiana state capitol was in use until the new and current building was completed in 1932. James Dakin and Farrett's masterpiece has been added to the National Historic Register and has become a Louisiana State Museum. From 1884 to 1888, William was appointed the head of the Office of the Supervising Architect, a sub-office of the United States Treasury that was in charge of building government buildings. From this position, he and his office designed many United States post offices. All of these buildings are very similar in that they all have characteristics of the Romanesque style, such as grand arch openings for the main entrance and some windows, use of brick or rough-cut stone for the exterior, and the use of decorative finials and towers. After 4 years in Washington, D.C., William Freret came home to New Orleans. One day, while he was out for a walk, he fell into a construction trench in the street and was injured. He died from pneumonia believed to be related to that fall on the 5th of December, 1911, at the age of 78. He was buried in the Confederate Veteran Association of the Army of the Tennessee Tomb, located in Metairie Cemetery. Now let's talk about our last architect, Thomas Sully. Thomas Sully was born in 1855 in an area that is now known as Gulfport, Mississippi. His parents were George Washington Sully and Harriet Jane Green. His father was a plantation owner and named his son after his great-uncle, a famous artist best known for his portraits of important American figures, including Jefferson, Lafayette, and Jackson. The Sully family divided their time between Mississippi and New Orleans, staying at a home in the Garden District located at Britannia and 9th Streets. Thomas attended private school. When he was 18 years old, Thomas left the nest and went to Austin and studied architecture in the firm of Larmor and Wheelock. He then moved on to apprentice in New York in the firm of George Slade and Henry Rutgers Marshall. Upon his return to New Orleans in 1877, he got a job as a city surveyor and worked his way into the construction industry. According to Frederick Starr in his book Southern Comfort, quote, he therefore simply presented himself at construction sites and within a few years gained sufficient practical experience to set himself up as a builder and to be listed as such in city directories, end quote. In 1881, Thomas Sully opened his own architectural firm. Let's talk a little bit about some of the buildings he worked on. New Orleanians are all familiar with the Columns Hotel as a popular spot to have a drink and watch the St. Charles streetcar go by, but this building looks way different than it did when it was built in 1884. In fact, the columns of the Columns Hotel are a fairly new addition. This magnificent mansion was built for Simon Hernsheim, a wealthy tobacco supplier, and cost $40,000 to build. With its arched windows, corbelled moldings, and rampant asymmetry, this building certainly falls into the Italianate style. But wait, there's more. This building used to have a 4-story tower projecting from the front, right side of the house. In New Orleans, Italianate-style architecture is typically exhibited by cast iron and arched windows. But in other areas of the United States, these large towers or belvederes are favored. In September 1915, a Category 3 hurricane slammed into New Orleans and badly damaged the upper stories of the tower. The front facade was remodeled to incorporate the now two-story bay into the porch, and the famous columns were added. It is at this time that the side gallery was enclosed to create space for interior bathrooms. And you can see where the side gallery was closed on the picture on the right-hand side. This house was added to the National Historic Register in 1982. While Thomas Sully is better known for his Queen Anne-style houses, we are lucky to have this Italianate-style residence. In 1884, Thomas Sully designed this unique building for the New Orleans National Bank. While its vertical massing gives an impression of Victorian-era style, this building also contains elements of the Richardsonian Romanesque style, included rusticated stone first level, brick upper levels, which are decorated with a modillion course in the cornice, and many examples of carved decorations like faces in the capitals and foliage motifs. The dormers are particularly decorative. They have finials that resemble torches ablaze. Confederate Memorial Hall was designed by Sully in 1890 for Frank T. Howard as a place to house the Louisiana Historical Association and Confederate artifacts. As it was located next to the Richardsonian Romanesque-styled Howard Library, this new building was designed in much the same manner, with rustic stone details applied to a mostly brown brick building. Carved terracotta details are reminiscent of the New Orleans National Bank discussed above. Please note that Richardsonian Romanesque style was all the rage, and while Sully was working on this building, Farrett was designing similar post offices for the federal government. The Hennen Building is also referred to as New Orleans' first high-rise. It would remain New Orleans' tallest building until 1904, when it was surpassed by the Carondelet Building. It was financed by the Maresk Building and Land Improvement Association, headed by John A. Morris, but named Hennen as that was his wife's maiden name. Her father was Alfred Hennen, veteran of the Battle of New Orleans in the War of 1812 and famous New Orleans lawyer. As common to many structures in New Orleans, this building rests on cypress pilings, but in a radical departure from the long popular brick and timber construction, the Hennen Building is supported by a steel frame. We need to take a step back now and look at Chicago's architecture for a moment. The first skyscraper to use steel frame was Chicago's Home Insurance Building, built in 1885. Designed by William LeBaron Jenney, steel frame provided a strong structure while also scaling back on weight. It is estimated that the Home Insurance Building was actually a third of the weight that it would have been had it been all masonry. We are getting lighter so we can get taller. Another added bonus to switching to steel frame construction is that it would allow for more windows. In a strictly masonry building, the exterior walls had to be stronger and thicker to carry the weight of the whole structure. But with this new steel skeleton, masonry was basically used to fireproof the iron columns and not needed for support. Added windows equals lots of natural light. After the Home Insurance Building, new Chicagoan edifices such as the Reliance Building, Fisher Building, and Marquette Building sprung up rapidly. This collection of early skyscrapers were referred to as the Chicago School of Commercial Construction, or Chicago School for short, and while they were not all exactly the same, they had important similarities. Steel frame was already mentioned, soaring height, and a new aesthetic. Many of these buildings abandoned adding decorative columns to the exterior, instead turning the whole building into a column. 3 separate, distinct parts reminiscent of the base, shaft, and capital. While it is surprising that Sully adapted this technology, what is surprising is that Sully adapted this technology so quickly. According to the Daily Picayune, quote, extensive travel, which the designer of the building has accomplished, has made him familiar with all of the requirements of similar structures in the North. In New York and Chicago, long study has familiarized him with 1,001 details, in themselves trivial, but in the aggregate of immeasurable importance that go to making the office building perfect, end quote. It is known that Thomas Sully and his wife did in fact travel to Chicago to witness the World's Fair, as this news was published in the Times-Picayune Society pages. As mentioned above, one of the key aesthetic switches included creating 3 separate levels to give the impression of a column. The Hennen Building definitely follows this pattern. The bottom 2 floors are given a rustic look and pierced with arched windows. The next 7 floors have a smoother texture and bay windows common in the Chicago School, and in the top floors are where one finds most of the decorative features of the building, including reliefs and modillions, giving it an almost busy appearance. As a column capital is more exuberant than the shaft that supports it, it is typically the top floors of these buildings that contain the most decoration. Overall, the decorative features seem to suggest a heavy influence of the Renaissance Revival style, which was becoming quite popular in the United States at the time, a blend of older decorative motifs such as Greek key window surrounds and the addition of sculpted terracotta ornaments, modillions, wreaths, pelicans, fit together to create an eye-catching edifice. Technological advances did not end with steel frame construction. The opening day advertisement in the Times-Picayune boasted steam heaters, gas and electricity, mail chutes, barbershop and bathrooms, and even special restrooms for the ladies. No expense was spared, and the building's final cost was $300,000. Initially, a state-of-the-art rooftop garden and restaurant were planned to cap off the building, but as early as April 1895, the garden was scrapped for a theater for plays. Observatory views of the city from our tallest building were offered for 15 cents. In 1922, an 11th story was added. Emil Wheel was the architect in charge of the renovation. Just 5 years later, the Maritime Building Corporation bought this building. The Maritime Building Corporation only owned it for 14 years out of its 124-year existence, but for some reason that name stuck. Sometimes it's called the Hennen Building, sometimes it's called the Maritime Building. It was added to the National Historic Register in 1986. The Hennen Maritime Building was a great success for Sully, and he was picked to work on another monumental commercial building, the third St. Charles Hotel. We already discussed the first St. Charles Hotel when we talked about Gallier. That building was struck down by fire and then rebuilt. The second St. Charles Hotel also burned. It was Thomas Sully who would have to do something different. He used many of the same ideas that he had learned from the Hennen Building, steel construction and Renaissance Revival style. If you notice, as in the case of the Hennen Maritime Building, the bottom 2 floors have a rustic look, then the next 4 floors are smoother, and then the top floor is where one finds the decoration. Sadly, this building was bought by the Sheridan in 1959 and then resold in 1953 to a man who wanted to rebuild a more modern St. Charles Hotel. The building was demolished in 1974, and today this is where one would find Place St. Charles. Sully was a prolific architect. According to Frederick Starr, quote, driving in his Surrey from Carrollton to Lee Circle in 1900, the architect could have admired over 6 examples of his own work. These are just the ones on St. Charles Avenue, and here we have a couple pictures of the residences that he did in the Queen Anne style. We're actually missing quite a few of them. With all of this work going on, he was also heavily involved in boating and was elected Commodore of the Southern Yacht Club from 1894 to 1897, and then part of the Board of Governors. Somehow, he even had time to design and build a few yachts. He was also a member of the Benevolent and Protective Order of the Elks and the Boston Club. He died in 1939 at the age of 84 of pneumonia. The newspaper did not identify the location of his burial, only that it was a private affair. Seeing as he was very involved with the Order of the Elks and helped design their tomb, I am including a picture of it in the slides because he might be there. Thomas Sully lived in an amazing time when architectural styles varied wildly from Italianate to Queen Anne to Romanesque, and Sully was definitely able to keep up. I hope you enjoyed this presentation about some of my favorite New Orleans architects. While I couldn't possibly show you all the buildings that they each built, I hope that I was able to provide a good variety of their works. I have a blog on my website that goes into greater detail, and please be sure to check that out at nolatours.com or follow us on Facebook.
Thank you so much, Katrina. We have a couple of questions in just a couple of minutes, so I'm going to just ask you a few that have come in. If anyone has any questions, we might have time for 1 or 2 more. So the question here is, when we see a pediment over post and lintel facade, as in the Three Sisters in Gallier Hall, how is that Greek Revival and not neoclassical?
Well, Greek Revival would be a subset of neoclassical. Greek Revival is how would you explain it? I mean, neoclassical is a word that describes Greek revival. So they're really, I don't know if they're exactly the same thing, but they're like the same thing. It's bringing the classical back around again.
Great. Perfect. That's the answer. Katrina, can you tell us a little bit, can you speak a little bit about the how, and I don't know if you know anything about this, but if there has been, and if there was slave labor involved in building some of these earlier buildings, or who the actual craftsmen were building some of these buildings?
Sure. Well, what I know about James Gallier is that he had, according to Frederick Starr, he had a crew of enslaved people that he would use on his projects. James Dakin, according to Scully, he owned 3 enslaved people at his death. And then William Farrett owned plantations, and he fought on the side of the Civil, on the Confederate side during the Civil War. So one might assume that he did as well. Thomas Sully was born in 1855, so he was later.
Great. Does anyone else have any other questions? Katrina, I don't see anything else coming in right now. This was a fantastic presentation. Thank you so much for sharing so much wonderful information about these architects. We so appreciated it. And I know I learned a lot. And thank you again to Stephen Richard Parnes for sponsoring our online classes. Thank you to the PRC members. Hopefully I'll see some of you tomorrow night at the World Trade Center virtually. And we'll see you at the next one. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.